Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I have got to tell you, I'm really excited about the talk that we have presented for several years now. There's other jobs. But he come up to us and what it's like for you that are online with us. But here it is snowing. Even better weather than we do right now. I'm really excited. I am. You're too. To talk about
in your lovely and beautiful soul.
But I didn't mention to him, I had forgotten he hadn't met me before. So, like I said, I've been waiting a few years to bring that. So,
I already has a couple. Lovely. And this is a story based in a game world that I over. It's actually based on an intense world I didn't create. It's created by many fantasy world, knights, and dragons, animals. And so he allowed them to take it in the world. He actually wrote so light raiders from Light Raider Camp are in this mountain fortress. And these impossibly high mountains created by the rescue that separate liberated land from the Dragonlands. And so to put it in a nutshell, Yes, and knights from the Light Raider border are striking out across this mountain border, through this mountain barrier, through portals and other ways, to enter the Dragonlands and rescue those who need saving.
interesting. So you are in here, spiritual elements, obviously. So is this allegory, fantasy, mixture of both? What do you label it?
So I would say that it is allegory. So what Dipple created was a little bit stronger on the allegorical side because it was designed for Bible study and things like that. It's a little bit more direct allegory. When you're taking something that's that allegorical and you're expanding it into an entire fantasy realm and you're filling in the gaps and the corners and the hidden places for story, you can't be as strict with allegory. And so I do put that in the author's notes to not get too laborious about allegory on what represents the church and what represents the world. But there is some allegory in there. And one of the things that we apply is scripture. And so we weave scripture. I say we because there's a whole team behind it working on this stuff.
And James R. Brown, who has been instrumental in the game side, but James and I have been working on fantasy language as well. And so the way we work scripture into the stories is it's spoken in that fantasy language so that it doesn't take you out of the fantasy realm into our world. And then the characters sort of interpret key word, key concept so that you can read through and you can go, oh, I know what that person is, but it's actually spoken in a fantasy language.
Oh, interesting. So you mentioned the game, which we have right here. And we were talking beforehand, so there's two different types of games that go with this.
Sure, yeah, there's three. So the original 1980s game, Dragon Raid, that Dickwell created, was a very, there's a big, if you're familiar with the tabletop role-playing game, is what it was. It was like a choose your adventure Bible study with more freedom for the characters. So you're rolling dice and you're creating this character who has weapons and stats that are based on the fruit of the spirit and the armor of God, and they're working through their way through these stories, making their own decisions. So it's choose your adventure on steroids almost, if you're not familiar with role-playing games. And so we are working on the Light Raiders Adventure Bible system, which will be the new version of that 35 years later. And that we hope to launch in June. In the meantime, we did have a lot of fans from the old system and some folks who wanted resources in this world. And so we started with a card game. So we have First Watch is a card game that is scriptures set in the world. You'll find some of the scriptures there. And every card has the real world application written by Dr. Gary Huckabee, who's a Holman Bible contributor and seminary professor and pastor. And then it has the fantasy application for the world. So you can see the characters, you can kind of find the Easter egg. Okay, what verse is that they just used? All right, I can find it on the card and I can see the fantasy effects that you see on the card happening in the story. But it's a scripture memory and application game is what it is. And then in addition, we created a board game that is also set in the world, and this is a whole family game. So even the younger members, this is a little bit older, and preteen and teen, and then the younger members of the family can take part in the world in 4 different games that are actually in this box. They're shorter and easier games to play together as a family.
Okay, there's something really fascinating about this game, because when he was showing it to me, I'm like, boy, they're really good at folding the board. It's not a board. It's actually a fascinating thing, and I know we have wandered away from the books. And I warned them, I go rabbit trail, so it's actually a cloth.
It's a cloth, yeah. This is the final version, which is really nice and embroidered on the edges and things. But we wanted with something that wouldn't be destroyed by vandals. And so we have so many games in our closet that have paper ripping away and white creases down the middle of the board and things like that. So I thought, well, what if we did it on microfiber? The same stuff that you clean your glasses with. And we found this company in Denver that prints beautiful ink, very, very color fast ink on microfiber. And the funny story about that one is we actually had to do 250 prototypes because there was a minimum print run. And so when we did the prototype, we did actually send out a ton of test games and things like that. But we did wind up with a bunch of boards that were left over from the prototype. And because they're the same microfiber cloth you clean your glasses with, we just cut them in our family. We cut them into squares, and we carry them around in our pocket. And this is what I clean my glasses with when I'm on the road with the airline. But the thing is like this particular one probably has been in my pocket for 4 months, being carried around, and it is still. I mean, this is what it looks like. And this one doesn't have the embroidered edges and things like that, but it hasn't faded. So I don't know. I think we made a good choice with the microfiber. It's extremely durable. You can crumple it up in your pocket, and you can lay it out flat again and start playing. So, pretty cool little extra thing there that happened with me.
Like I said, a little rabbit trail there. It's just fascinating. So we should wander back to the books. So I like one of the questions we were talking about with the biblical message in there. What do you want people to get from both Soldier and Bear Knight? What is that biblical message you're looking for with people? Especially teens. I know you originally advertised, I tell it to adult and teens, by the way, just they all read it. So what is that message you're looking for?
So overall with light readers and scripture, one of our goals is understanding scripture in context. And so not just memorizing Bible verses, but understanding what those Bible verses mean in the context of the chapter and in the context of scripture as a whole. And that was one of the key things of having Dr. Huckabee go through with the 85 verses we were using. They're used in the books and in the system, and doing his own applications based on scripture as a whole. So one of the things that we want to do is bring people back to understanding scripture in full context, and not just memorizing. The other thing is each of these books, Wolf Soldier, Bear Knight, and the follow-on are based on roles from the original game. So your character, as the character grew and progressed, could eventually become a wolf soldier or a bear knight. They were some of the most favored roles in the 1980s game. But the wolf represents loyalty. And so in that first story, we're talking about loyalty to the rescuer's mission. So we're talking about loyalty to Christ. What does God want from me? Understanding his will, getting into the word of praying and understanding his will and his will over mine. In Bear Knight, we're talking about fear. Bears represent courage in the game world. They will run into battle with reckless abandon. And so we're dealing with different kinds of fear in the story on various levels. And how we deal with that and how God helps us deal with those fears. And so that's where we're, and then we have another one coming out soon that's based on another character, but we won't reveal that just yet.
Now, I don't know if everybody out there has read it yet. I have read both of them. And so I know the answer to this question, but I'm gonna ask it anyways. How much crossover is there? Is it like you have to read them in order?
That's a good question. You kind of do, in my opinion. Because they're beginning here and they're reopening Light Reader Academy. The academy has been dormant for years. They've stopped sending missions into the Dragonlands, and they've kind of hunkered down in their own borders in Keladev. And so now evil has sort of festered at the gate. And so we have to rekindle the fires of Light Reader Academy to begin to push back against that and stop the dragon invasion. So they're new cadets, they're initiates in that first book, becoming cadets. Now in the second book, we're a year later and more than a year later, and the cadets have matured, they're becoming cadet scouts. So they're increasing in rank and their abilities and things like that, and they're maturing in their relationships with each other, and their relationship with the rescuers. So I think you really do want to read them in order.
I agree. Oh, I got you.
I got it right.
So this is a good question that came in. Where did inspiration for this series come from? Because I know you took over something that was written in the 80s, but it's still something that you had inspiration for.
Well, yes. So when I was a teenager in Colorado Springs in the 80s, my dad was a pastor of a very prominent church there in Colorado Springs. And so I was guinea pigging every youth Bible study program to come out of the Navigators and IBS and whoever else was there. And somebody handed him a box of Dragon Bait. And that became the thing that had the most impact on me, because I was able to engage with scripture in a new way by taking part in this fantasy world and seeing the applications from kind of two sides of the brain. And so that really, the Light Reader system, which only really lasted from 84 to 86, that stuck with me all the way through high school and the Air Force Academy and my Air Force career. And so it was when I was between books and I began to write stories for my own kids based in that world and take them through the old game. Those stories got back to Dick Wolf, and he asked me to take this forward. And so, including writing a series of novels in the world. And so that was where the inspiration came from. This is the thing that had a huge impact on my relationship with Christ. And so I wanted to share that with others.
Interesting. Actually, this kind of goes right with it, is what was your favorite location to write about in Bear Night?
Oh, that's a hard one. Because there's so many good ones, and you know, you're filling in the corners of the map from something that was created years ago, where there were only a few adventures in the original game. And so we saw a little town pop up here and a location pop up here. And so now we're filling in the corners of the map. And one of those things in the original game was called the Ghost War. And so as we were beginning to rebuild the topography of the land and all that stuff, this became something. The Ghost War is right on the boundary of the forest borders, what we call Silshana in the name in the language of the world.
I'm really glad you're teaching me how to say something.
Which really just means Black Forest. But the Tagamore was the home of the Suborath, which the House of Subor. And the Tagamore has this really neat feel because it's a deep canyon that has unique properties in this mist that seeps up from the canyon, that is infused also in the metal alloys in the ground there, that if you grew up there, you can actually kind of float around and jump and fly on the mist. And so the Tagamore was fiercely defended by the House of Subor until the dragons betrayed them. And when they did, that's when a part of the canyon was obliterated and the mist seeped into the forest, and then that dragon took over the Black Forest, which became the Forest Quarters. And so they use the properties of the mist to deceive people and create these apparitions and things and mimic the idea of a different kind of afterlife. So anyway, creating the Tagamore, which was the Ghost War in the original game, and expanding that and then connecting that with the history to the Forest Quarters was probably the most fun I've had writing for him forever.
And it's a little creepy.
Yes.
Gotta throw that out there. So, okay, so each one of these, now there's only two, but I feel like they got a little bit darker because of the evil that is coming. Is the third one, I mean, obviously they are filled with hope too. You'll know that when you read the books. I mean, there's a lot of hope in there.
That's a good question, and the reason that you feel darker, particularly in the Bear Knight, is the subject we're dealing with is fear. And we're dealing with fear in the very obvious and objective way with the Forest of Horrors. And then we're also in the sub-stories dealing with the fear of failure, with Kara's character in particular, and the fear of not keeping up with friends and things like that. So we're dealing with, especially this is a young adult series, we're dealing with some of those young adult fears in addition to the more allegorical and more direct Forest of Horrors type of fears. So we start with the prisoner who's being tortured in the Forest of Horror. And that is dark because we chose to go with first person. Again, when I say we, because the whole team, and before I do anything in these books, I consult the entire team. Together we decided that to really feel that what that character is feeling, the prisoner we call him, to not do any spoilers, what the prisoner is feeling throughout the story until he's rescued, spoilers. It is more present for the reader because we're using that first person perspective, and we're saying that apart from the third person perspective. In the rest of the story, get into the more technical side of the writing. So the next book, we'll see some of that maturity as the series grows, but you won't see quite as much of the creepy side of the darkness because we're no longer dealing with the fear that was the theme of the story.
Can you share the theme of the next one, or is that give too much away?
And we want to do some things where people guess, and honestly, fans of the original Dragon Raid will have a leg up on this. I will say that we're dealing with faithfulness. So in each one of these applies to an animal. The animal that we're dealing with in there, it's all about faithfulness. We are dealing with the concept of what is it? Storming the gates of hell. We have a lot of folks talking about we're going to storm the gates of hell. There's that's a controversial issue. What does it mean? And is there anything in scripture that says we're supposed to rush and storm the gates of hell? So when we're going to deal with that in that story. So on that side, when some mistakes are made, you're also going to see some kind of harsh results and realities.
Uh-oh. I hate
Fantasy.
when favorite characters about it. So, okay, so you have a 3-book series. You have a game. Where are you going with all of this Light Raider enterprises for last?
Sure.
Where is this headed?
So the ultimate goal here is discipleship. And so we have been creating over the last 3 years a kind of a new and modernized version of Dragon Raid that is accessible and not limited to that Venn diagram of people who want a Bible study and people who love really deep and rules-heavy role-playing games. So that Venn diagram, where it meets in the middle, that's a smaller group of people. So we've been creating, and James R. Brown was a freelance writer on the One Ring games for the Lord of the Rings. This man is a genius, and he's the man he's the mind behind the rules of the new system. And it has the advanced rules for those who love that kind of stuff. But primarily we have this system that you can sit down and play, and your team, whether it's youth or adults, can live a story in this fantasy world. And about every episode, we call them, every episode has specific scriptures that you're applying in the fantasy world that you'll wrap up with a Bible study, like a 10-minute Bible study called the Know, Grow, and Go system. So what do we know from these scriptures? What did we learn when we were applying them in the world? How can we grow from what we've learned here? And then how can we take that in these hands and go? So that's the ultimate goal is we are designing a 12-semester Bible study program where you're taking part in this story, you're growing in rank from potential, who hasn't even come to the academy. You read about potentials and initiates and wolf soldier, to cadet, to scout, to knight, to guardian. And so you can go through that entire thing. And then once we've established that 12-semester curriculum, we'll also be bringing in more free-form games so folks can just once they've graduated that system, and because the goal is the discipleship. And then they can just break out and begin to explore the world, and eventually those cloth maps that we will have table-sized maps where you can just branch out and go into that fantasy world, and whatever region you're in, you can draw a card and find a prompt and find out what's happening to your team in that world. And we've already talked to manufacturer. We can do that with that cloth, and we're so excited about it.
And you still only have a little box, so.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, oh, I know what I was gonna ask, so you have the 3 books, do you have plans for more books centered around this then too, or have you not kind of plotted that out that far? I mean,
There are plans. The priority, we talked earlier about time. Yeah, the priority right now is the system, is the game, and that curriculum, because we're going to be putting out, we're launching with the first semester, and then we're going to rapidly be putting out the next 11 semesters after that, as quickly as we can. And once that's done, we'll look at additional a new book series set in. So this is one era of the story when that, after the Language Academy had been shut down for 2 generations. There are multiple eras in this world that we can create stories in. So we're kind of excited about that.
interesting, I'm looking forward to all of this. Now, the one question I know there's gonna be parents that ask this because I get questions about magic and things. So there's a lot of negativity in the Christian world. I'm not gonna argue that, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons and role playing. So what is your argument with why is this okay then?
Yeah, why is this different? And that's a nuanced question. Why is Tolkien different? Why is C.S. Lewis different? Because I'm not actually a fan of D&D proper, because it's an amoral system. And so you have to work real hard to kind of fix that if you're using D&D as a Christian. And so where does the power lie? Who's sovereign in this world? And so when you look at Tolkien and you look deep into the Silmarillion and the other lore, you can see who is sovereign in that world. What Gandalf, even though he's called a wizard in the world, what he represents. And what happens when the little guy, the Hobbit, tries to take hold of that power. And so C.S. Lewis, similar constructs. So with our worlds, we are very, very clear, both in the game and in the books, that the rescuer is sovereign, and that's where the power lies. And when they're using scripture in fantasy situations that do have fantasy effects, that obliterate some goblins, things like that, break down a wall, light up a path. What does that represent, for one thing? And two, is it the light raider who is just making that declaration and the wall falls, or is it the light raider making a prayer to the rescuer and seeing how he responds? We actually, in the next book, we're going to actually get some of those unexpected effects when prayers aren't answered exactly as we expect. And that's part of that faithfulness question of the next story. But yes, so it's why is that different? It's all about who is sovereign in the world. Where does the power lie? Like Acts 8, and Simon the magician. We talk about. You can go in and see what the Bible says about that, and it's very similar.
Interesting. So we actually are going to go a little off here, just because some of the questions we're getting in. One person asked, what other genre would you like to write in? Because you've written fantasy and you've written action adventure. Is there another genre you'd be interested in?
Well, I've written spy novels. I've written mystery. So one of the things I wanted to write in was procedural mystery, and that came out in June. That was Elysium Tide, and then I had written military thrillers, and then we did the spy thrillers and sort of CIA type thrillers with Talia Inger and friends, and we got to do some reformed thieves there too. So there's the delicate talk about walking a tight wire. It's like, wait a second, what your Christian book stuff? What? Thieves, cat thrillers? Okay, how do you make that work? That's a whole different discussion. And then we did the standalone, which was the sort of Bourne and Bourne-esque. In fact, the Evangelical Libraries Association wrote a whole essay on why this is Bourne meets Clancy, but that was the Puritan Trail. So I think I have absolutely no desire to write romance. So I not sure, I wrote children's mysteries for Simon and Schuster. So I don't know if there's anything I haven't covered that I want to write.
Okay,
Really, what I want to play, the world I want to play in is right here, and it's a big world.
so, have you always wanted to be an author?
Yeah, ever since I was a kid, when I was like 4 or 5, I wish I could remember the exact age this happened. My mom took me to a library, and in that library there was a picture book. And it was one of those broad, wide coffee table type books, and wide, right? And the artist had done all these beautiful paintings that had fantasy as a feel, but the one in the middle was both pages was this. It was a kind of a glade, with pines and mountains in the background, and on it was at night, and there were glowing lights, and on this glade there was this like circus had come to town, or a fair. And so you had all these characters throughout the glade, and you had the juggler, and you had the person selling cakes, and you had the big top and the guy in the top hat beckoning people in, and off in almost not noticeable at the edge of the trees, the edge of the glade, was a little boy in his pajamas watching it all happen. And so I felt like that little boy. And I wanted to know the stories of all these people in the glade. And so I wanted to write those stories. Ever since then, I just wanted to write the stories of all the people at the circus.
So do you remember the name of that book?
I have no idea. I wish I
It
did.
sounds really good.
I know. If I could get a copy, I would it'd be hanging in my office.
So, okay, world, let's see if you can find that book. So, this is actually, I love this question. Which is easier to write, your action adventure spy novels or fantasy?
That I wish you could see my board at home, because I think I put equal research and study into both. When I entered the fantasy world, because my first fantasy writing was for Simon and Schuster, but I was writing fantasy where kids are tracking down historical artifacts, solving real historical mysteries in order to stop present day villains. So even though there were fantastical elements, there was a ton of research involved. And so, I would have told you before I began writing these that writing military thriller is harder, because my fans in my military thriller, if I make one little tiny error, will write me about it and will tell me what I messed up. And then I also have to be careful that I don't say something classified because of my past experience. So that's very research heavy and research intensive. But the fact is that when I began writing these, we're creating a fantasy language. We're making everything marry up with knowing what the game that we're creating and making the characters follow the rules of the game in different ways. And so I think it turns out that writing fantasy is just as difficult as writing military thrillers. So I can't make fun of fantasy authors anymore.
And okay, so you guys know, I'm not a writer, and I always thought, well, fantasy, you can just tell your readers what's there. You don't think that's right, it's just right. It's fantasy world. So
One thing about that is actually even harder is when you're writing a military thriller, it has to be believable.
right.
But you're writing a military thriller based on technology that's present or that's on the cusp. Okay. And so what is real and what is realistic is there in front of you to research and find. When you're developing a fantasy world, you still have to make it realistic. It has to make sense for the reader. Even though it does sound weird, but when you're writing fantasy, it has to be realistic fantasy. The characters can't just do whatever. They have to follow a rule set. They have to follow physics. They have to follow what's true for their history. And so you're actually researching and creating in order to set those boundaries so that it is believable to the reader and realistic within the fantasy world. So that actually is a little bit harder.
Interesting. I see. I want to see. I know I'm not a writer. That I don't have that gift. So we're so one of the things I was thinking of, you were talking about, you're developing this thing, and there's a thing with the fantasy books now that they come out with these side books where they like list. Well, the Harry Potter ones have the animals and all the creatures. Have you thought of doing one of those for this?
Well, for one, we have all the versions you can go find, so that's the thing. For Bear Night, you actually go to the back of the book. And we did get that question with Wolf Soldiers. Like, hey, I'd like a glossary of terms and locations and things like that. So you go to the back of the book And I'm trying to do this on the fly here. And you've got, names and, the different houses, and you've got locations, and you've got terms. And then there's actually a game that they play in the story. I was very excited when I found out that billiards is a fairly ancient game, fairly old game in terms of Middle Ages and who played it and things like that. And so we actually created a game that you can play on a pool table. That's actually played in the Light Raiders world. It's called Vanquish, and we put the rules and everything in the back. Very nice. So we didn't do a separate one, but it's all right there in the book for you.
Awesome. So make sure you read from cover to cover, because not only that, I think it's in here too, is the map. Is it in this?
Oh yeah, so those, and by the way, James R. Brown did those maps. I need him writing and working on rules, and so you ask him to do a map, and that's what you get. Every line and months of work, and so you get to enjoy those his work there in Wolf Soldier. And then we brought in different map makers so that we could free up James to work on the games, but also here for Fair Night.
Now, is there other people that you can mention tonight that is working on all this with you?
David and Kerry Brooks have been key. John Carroll is our director of communications. And so he's been out there. I think thanks to John, we may get to make an appearance at San Diego Comic-Con. And so, yeah, there have been lots of folks that were stewards before I took over. So yeah, there's a whole team behind it. David is the one working on the app. And so yeah, just amazing people. And then of course my wife Cindy is acting kind of as CFO and cat wrangler to make it all happen.
Interesting. That is a great group of people. Now, we've been talking in solid forms here. Where can they find you online?
Lightraiders.com.
Okay.
So just like it says on the book, these are the Light Raiders trilogy, the Light Raider Academy series, Light Raiders plural, with lightraiders.com.
Interesting. Okay, how about you?
I'm on James R. Hannibal, so all of my other books, and there's a bit of world exploring you can do for my other series on James R. Hannibal. If you want to buy them, we only have one store connected to Light Raiders. So if you want a signed book, you can go to Light Raiders, and any of my series are there. But if you want to explore the worlds of the 777 Chase Covert Squadron or Talia Eager and the Thieves, then you can go to jamesrhannibal.com.
Super. So thank you all for joining us tonight. This is fascinating. And then he lost his mic. It must be done. So is there anything else you want us to know about, well, any of your writing, in fact, but this is for sure that I have not asked?
Not that I can think of. I mean, we've covered a little bit. We're going to be at the Teach Them Diligently Old School conferences this year. So look for the Light Raiders booths if you're in Pigeon Forge or Austin for those homeschool conferences. We're going to be at Florida Parent Educators Association, a huge one, at the end of May. So look for us there. And just watch out for what we're bringing. Come and sign up for our newsletter so you know what's coming.
Oh, the one thing I did forget to ask though is book number 3 is due out in 2024.
February 2024.
Perfect. That's what I need to know. And we will try to have them here without the snow. That might work better. No stuff. Might have to have you in March stuff. So, but thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming in. It was so good to talk to you. And like I said, we could probably do this all night.
Thanks for bringing me in and letting me go on and on and on and on.
We can go on and on. And I just smile because this is fascinating to me. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you all had a good evening and drive safe tonight. Bye now.